Hi everyone, this is Marie-Ève, and now we're going to look at a production scene using different types of blurs. So we've put together here a scene that will allow you to practice using the different types of blurs that we've seen previously. So if I press play, you'll see that we have a character appearing in a zoom blur, we have a foreground that is blurred, we have a background here that is blurred, and we have even the inner structure that is gradually blurred. So that's what we're going to practice doing in this exercise. So you can see here that I have different mats. I have a green mat that will be used to blur the outside background. I have a gradient mask here that will allow me to gradually blur the inside of the building. And I have a foreground element that I will also blur. And finally, we'll make this character appear in using a zoom blur as well as some transparency nodes. So as we work through that, we'll also see how to use additional nodes. The first thing we're going to do here is to disable anything we don't need to work with right now. So we're going to disable our foreground and gradient masks. You can disable these elements by pressing D for disable. You could always go in the timeline view and uncheck them here as well. If you need to reactivate them, you can press A for activate, so D for deactivate and A for activating. We are going to start by blurring our outside background. If I disable this element, you'll see that we have this city outside the window. This is where, because this background is a flat bitmap, let me increase the quality of this thumbnail so that you can see it better. So this is one flat bitmap image, meaning I don't have it layered, so I cannot just apply a blur on what would be outside the window on a separate layer. Therefore, I have to create masks to identify which areas should be blurred on this image. Now, this is where I like to use the variable blur so I can control what section would be blurred, and I could even apply a different level of blur on the rest of the image. Therefore, from my node library, I will search in for my blurs and I'll grab the blur variable. Again, you could play with different blurs like the box blur or the Gaussian blurs and use them, use the mat and connect it to the mat port as well and obtain similar effects. But you'll see as you practice using blurs, you'll end up finding which ones are your favorite, and depending also on the production you're working on, they may have a specific style required. But in this case, we're going to use the blur variable. So first thing I'm going to do, going to connect that on my background. You can hold down the Option or Alt key to have nodes connect automatically on existing cables. It's always handy when you have long cables and you don't know where the composite node is at. So I always connect that on that cable. So now I have this element connected in, and this is where I can get my mat connected in the mat port. Again, right now I'm in OpenGL view and it's preserving the ability to see my mat. So sometimes if I want to continue working and not see this mask in the OpenGL view, this is where I'm going to go get a visibility node, which would allow you to hide something from the render view. So that means it would not render out from your scene at all, or something that you don't want to see in the OpenGL view. So here I'm connecting in this guy and I'm disabling the OpenGL view settings. So right now I can see outside, and if I go in my render view, right now I can go and adjust the blurriness parameter of my blur variable. So in here, now if I wanted to blur what's outside of my mask, I would have to adjust the black radius because it's what's transparent. And if I want to adjust what is in the white area, which is actually what is opaque, do not get confused with this is just the background color of the thumbnail, so that doesn't mean it's the white radius. So here it's really what's inside this area, which is opaque, that is part of my white radius. If I increase this level of blurriness, it will now blur what's inside, and you always have to give it a bit of time to calculate. Make sure that your auto calculation is on. Sometimes people tend to disable it by mistake and they're wondering why the effect is not appearing. So make sure this is enabled. And then You can increase depending on the level of blurriness you require. Then you can adjust the white radius. Again, I always leave my quality to high. If I wanted to blur what's outside of it, I could either double tap on this option or enable invert matte, and then you can see it would blur what's inside of it. If I need a slight level of blur inside of it because I want to have my character stand out, then I'm going to reverse the matte again to its original position, and I could give, if I want, a little level of blur, maybe a level radius of 1, and have a little bit of blur on my background independently from this one, or maybe 2 to make it a bit stronger. So you can see with one mask, I have control to blur 2 sections of my background independently. So that I find that very handy. That's why I like to use blur variables for elements like this. So now I'm putting it back to what it is because I'm going to use my gradient mask to blur the rest of the inner structure here. So that's the first use of a blur here. It's our blur variable with the mask on our window. Next, we are going to blur the foreground element here. And so we'll have to play a bit with this one because obviously it's not layered on top of it. So if I have blur against blur, I may have a weird edge going on there. So I'll show you how you can deal with something like this. So let's enable our foreground matte. So now we should have our blue matte appear. And you can already see that because we blurred the outside of it, you have this section being blurred there. So we're going to have to work a little bit with that. So now I will play with some elements, like I'm going to bring in a cutter node. And the reason why I'm going to do that is I want to extract this element from the foreground, because if I blur it straight on the background, I will start to lose control and have too much blur. I won't be able to work with that little gap that I need to patch up or cover up as I blur this element. Obviously, in ideal production, you would receive this element on a separate layer, but when you do compositing, you will get all sorts of things and you won't always get the ideal situation. So in this case here, I will get my background element connected in here. So right now in this cutter node, I will have the entire background connected there. And with my foreground element, I'll bring this in and I will cut my background. But now, as you can see, it's cutting everything but the element that I want. Again, I can increase the quality of this so you can see that a bit better. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to invert that matte so that the actual piece I get is only the foreground element. So now that element, I'm going to be able to blur it because I want to kind of have a strong, even blur on this one because it's in the foreground. I will bring in a Gaussian blur. I could also go with the radial blur, depending which one you prefer. They have a similar effect. And then I'll connect it below this foreground element. Now, if I go inside this, I can increase the blurriness of that Gaussian blur. But now you can see I have this kind of weird effect happening. But first of all, my blur is a little too strong because I also have, as I blur my background, the other foreground element that is behind it starts to appear. So it has this kind of blur on top of a clear element. So if I zoom in, you'll see that it's blurred inside. So if I was to disable or disconnect this element here, so it's blurred fine, but it's when I put the clear one under it that it starts to not be perfect. So this is where I'm going to bring in a matte resize. I use matte resize for so many things when I do compositing. So I'm going to bring in the matte resize. What does the matte resize do? Is actually taking a shape and making it bigger. So I'm going to connect it to this foreground mask because it was drawn perfectly on the shape. It's not big enough to kind of cover that gap between the two shapes. Therefore, with this matte resize, I can go in it and start increasing the shape. Now, to understand what's going on, you can see that already is doing a bit of a better job. So to see what it does, I'm going to bring in a display node with Control Y or Command Y. I'm going to connect that to my foreground, switch to display 2. So now I can see the size of my element. But if I go under the matte resize, you can see that it's making it bigger. So if I was to exaggerate that, I could increase the size even more. And so that allows you to do so many things. I use that a lot when I do glows around elements. So I do halo and so many different things. So it's always good to know that matte resize exists. So right now I'll just leave it at 2 to see if it's going to do a good job. Sometimes I have to balance the amount of blur and the size of the matte resize. So I'm going to go back to my display. And then I'm going to play a little bit with that amount of blur there. So I'm going to close that back, Gaussian blur. So I don't want to put it too strong because then it kind of causes me too much of a gap between it. But then I may have to play with the size of the matte resize so that it kind of covers up that gap in between. And so as you play with that, you're gonna start having a bit of a better effect, and that kind of black halo will disappear from it. And the other thing I would do, since it's a foreground element here, I also may cheat so that you don't have too much of a black halo. I may make that darker. So I start to have a bit of a, close that there, just so we keep our node view clean. Always keep the good habit of get your nodes clean and in order. There's nothing more frustrating than opening somebody else's scene and the node view is a mess and we don't understand anything of what's going on. So we're going to bring that in. And to make it darker, I tend to use the hue and saturation node. So I'm going to bring that, connect that onto the Gaussian blur, always using my Alt key. So I'm going to reduce the lightness of the piece. And I could increase the saturation a little bit if I want to. So now I have a bit of a blurred foreground. If we close that and bring that back, Shift M to reset my view size. So now I have a blurred background and I have a Gaussian blur with some hue saturation to make that darker, using the matte resize to make it a bit bigger. So depending on the design you have, the scenes you have, you may have to adjust the size and the radius of your blur. So that's kind of a cheat for something that would be stuck on one layer and you try to blur it, pretending it's in the foreground. Ideally, the design team should have these elements separated to make a cleaner job, but you can achieve quite good results with this anyway. Next, we're going to use a blur box. So I'm going to look for my box, blur box. Here it is. We're going to use a blur box to have that kind of lens blur with combination of our gradient mask. I drew a rectangle with a gradient like this, but you could also use the animated matte or use the gradient node as well. So it's up to you. There's different techniques possible to make different gradient shape. The part that is important is that you have a part that is opaque going gradually to a transparent area. And so this, I can use that as my mask for my blur box. So what I'm going to do in this one, give myself a bit more room, is that I have my background here passing through, and this is this section that I'm going to blur. I'm going to start cascading blur effects. So I'm going to put my blur box here, but I don't want to blur the entirety of the background because I already blurred this, which is fine because it's on top of it. But I don't want to re-blur my background because I already am with the blur variable. So I need to matte this. But not only that, is that I will cut this mask with my other matte shape. So we have a node called the matte composite. So if I bring it, our matte composite there, it allows me to connect different mattes in this port. For example, I can connect my, expand this, gonna bring my foreground matte in it. And just to make sure, I'm going to change the background. So I have a foreground matte here, and I will do a combination of my window mats. It allows me to comp mats together, and I could choose if they get subtracted. So by double clicking on it, you can choose the way these elements get combined together. But right now I want to have both of them adding up. So they get combined, and I'm going to actually cut my gradient mask. And I don't need a cutter node here. I could use a cutter node, but I can go straight into the matte port of my gradient mask. So now this one, I'm going to change the background. You can see that now what's going on is that my gradient mask gets cut by this element, but I'm going to reverse these elements so that actually I have my opaque area here. I'll make that bigger to make sure that you can see that well. But now I have this opaque area, but now because of this composite coming in, it's cutting all the areas that are already blurred that I do not want to touch. So that's pretty handy. And as you play with this combination, you can add, subtract, depending how you want to have your mask combining. So now I have mats cutting a mat that will now come and cut the blur box. So I'm going to collapse this and recollapse this, keep that clean. And so what's going on here is I can go and increase my level of the radius blur. So you'll see that this section will slowly become blurrier as this area will remain crisper. So I can see this area is blurred, and it's using the box blur, so you can see it's more like that square rectangle blur that is happening right now. So now I see you have a pretty decent example of using these types of blurs together. The last step we have to do is getting our character to appear in using a zoom blur. So we'll go get our zoom blur, blur radial zoom. I'm going to connect that on my character. I don't need to create anything special on this one. No need to create any masks. But what I need to do is to display the point of origin and move it to the right location. But if you remember, if you don't want to animate it or create keyframes for it, disable the animate mode before moving it. I'm going to move it. I'm going to place it at the center about the belt level. And then I'm going to decide which level of blur I want in which preset. So first of all, I'm going to give it a good preset. That's pretty big actually. And then I'm going to spin it like this. I'm going to give it a kind of twirly blur. Maybe this is a little too much, but at the same time, we're going to make her appear. So this is where I want to animate this level of blurriness. I will find my radial zoom here in the timeline view, and you can click on the plus to expand and see the different parameters. It's fairly easy to use. So I'm going to find the blurriness parameter and add a keyframe on the first frame, and I want it to appear in like half a second. So about frame 12, I will add another keyframe. So I know for a fact that I want this value to be no blur at all because she's going to be done appearing. And on this one, I want it rather high so that she's fairly zoomy. And as I move in the scene, she's going to get to appear in the scene. And then I could also, if I want, adjust the velocity so that maybe she comes in really fast and then it slows out, and I can then she has a bit of a taper out in that animation, and then I can apply that. I could make it even stronger, so you can decide how strong you want that to be. Maybe I don't want it as strong. Apply next and close. So also I may not want her to start appearing right at the first frame. So what I'm going to do is grab these keyframe and slide them in a little bit. But so that means that she's going to be blurred like this for the first frames until it starts animating towards the value of 0. So in order for that to not be visible here or slowly fade in, I'm going to add a combination of an animation of a transparency node so that it fades in. So if I look for my transparency node, here, transparency, I will connect that below my elements. I always use transparency to make anything fade in or fade out. So again, I can collapse this node and then, not collapse it here, but collapse it here. You can see that I have my transparency node here. Same thing, I have my transparency parameter. So the part that is interesting here that you have to understand is it's how transparent it is. So I'm going to add my keyframe here, and I'm going to make it appear or stop fading out about halfway through here. So at the beginning, I want it to be 100% transparent. So it doesn't mean 100% opaque, it's 100% transparent. And then here, I want it not transparent at all. So it's going to be fully appearing. So at the beginning, you can see that it's going to start appearing and she's going to be animating in. And I can even give it a bit of a nudge inside so that the animation is not too long. And I have a few frames and then she is appearing in. And so once you have all of that, you are ready to export your movie. And you can do so by doing File, Export, Movie, and then you can export your QuickTime movie wherever you want it to be. So that's here an example of a few different blurs you could use in the same scene and how to deal with mattes in one background to have different parts of it blurred in different ways.